So let's talk about some of the things that might prevent you from accepting what might seem to be too good to be true news. Now, these can be religious beliefs or traditions, or it could be a materialistic worldview, the belief that there is no evidence, or maybe doubt because you haven't heard this before. And if it's really so self evident, wouldn't you have already heard it? So, in this module, I'm going to address a few things I believe may stand in your way of learning and accepting this material. Thus, they will stand in your way of reflecting and improving. So, what I'm about to tell you might seem too good to be true, but there are two main stumbling blocks to be aware of, both of which I've mentioned earlier. Religious blocks. First of all, this material may be at odds with your religion or the traditions that you follow. And I want to be really clear. I have nothing against religion. I come from a highly religious background. My grandfather and his parents were pastors. My parents raised me in a devout Christian home. I attended church for close to 6 decades. I know religion comforts billions of people and makes them better people to themselves, to each other, and to their families. And I don't want to take any of that away. Now, the truth I'm presenting you may be incompatible with your religion's teaching about death and dying, or it may be incompatible with your current view of scriptures like the Bible. And I know for many people, this is a significant obstacle. You've been taught just believe. You've been taught that faith is a virtue. To ask for evidence is taboo. It shows a lack of faith. And again, back to the parable of doubting Thomas. Do you see Thomas as the bad guy in that story? That's kind of the way it was taught to me. The other disciples didn't need to see Jesus' wound to believe he'd been resurrected, yet Thomas did. But have you ever wondered why Thomas is the bad guy? Did Jesus condemn Thomas? I don't think so. The New Living Translation puts it this way. Jesus said, then put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. So I think it's interesting that Jesus simultaneously tells Thomas to believe while he's offering evidence. He didn't condemn Thomas for wanting evidence. To paraphrase, he said, here, look at the evidence and then believe. Some say the evidence is confused and contradictory. It may appear that way at first. Some people, for example, who have had NDEs see green fields. Others see cities. Some go through a tunnel. Some do not. Some have life reviews. Some see loved ones. Some don't see any loved ones. So people might ask, which is true? So let's take on the NDE question for a moment. There are many things about NDEs that are almost universal, and there are some things that aren't. But let's look at whether heaven is like a beautiful garden or a big, beautiful city. That's some of the argument people have made. Well, it's either one or the other. We have no reason to believe the spiritual world is less complex or diverse than the world we find ourselves in. I think a lot of us has been pictured heaven as like a big city with pearly gates, and it's a city. When you think about how many billions of people would be there, it'd be a very big city. But let's think about, from our own experience here on Earth. If you were to drop an alien in New York City and another in the middle of a forest in Northeast United States, and ask each to report back on what the Earth is like, they report very different experiences, different temperatures, different foliage or lack of foliage. One will report the world is full of people. The other would say there are no people at all. And which would be correct? Well, they'd both be correct. They were seeing different parts of the world. We shouldn't expect all reports of the afterlife to be alike just because, well, we shouldn't expect them to be alike because different people see different aspects of it. And in the case of the NDE, they also seem to be highly tailored to the benefit of the experiencer. So again, back to the religious convictions. I hope it won't prevent you from considering the evidence that I'm presenting. When I post near-death experiences on my YouTube channel, I get the most vehement comments from self-proclaimed Christians. If the near-death experience doesn't mention Jesus, or if it mentions reincarnation, they shut down. If it mentions anything not mentioned in the Bible, they claim it's unbiblical and therefore it's untrue at best, or maybe it's even a lie straight from Satan. The Bible itself doesn't claim to be infallible, nor does it claim to be exhaustive. In fact, it even mentions at one time that it didn't even record everything that Jesus did because it would fill up all the books of the world. We do know a lot more now than the Bible writers knew. That's no there's no shade thrown towards the Bible writers. It's no disrespect to people that lived 2,000 years ago. The Bible has hints of both NDEs and reincarnations in its pages. I believe they tried to remove reincarnation from the Bible, some of the later editors, but they missed some of those. And I talk about those in this program. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to consider the evidence that I'm presenting to you with an open heart and an open mind. I'm not going to ask you to take anything on faith. So consider the giant mass of testimony we have from hundreds or thousands, or actually it's literally millions of people who've had near-death experiences, who describe in detail the dying process and the nature of the afterlife. Consider how Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, Acts chapter 9, seeing a bright light, hearing a booming voice, being struck blind, miraculously regaining his sight, and changing his life so dramatically that he changed his name, sounds a lot like an NDE. Compare Paul speaking about praying in the Spirit in 2 Corinthians 12 and finding himself in a heavenly place where he was caught up in the paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. How much does that sound like an NDEer who tells us they don't have the words for what they saw and heard? So again, I think a lot of the things that we find in our scriptures, in our teachings about our spiritual life, are not contradictory with what we've been reported by people who have had NDEs or mediums report. I think the reports we're getting now just expand on what we know from places like the Bible. Now, I'm passionate about this because unfortunately, religion keeps some people in a bind. When I taught at my church, and I taught a class for people that were learning in the church, it was kind of orientation to the church, and would tell them about church doctrine, etc. There was a young man who was tormented by the fact that he just knew he was going to hell when he died. It was heartbreaking. No matter what we said to him, no matter how we tried to convince him, he had sins that he was judging himself for in the past and sins that he was still committing to that day. And they were sins that he was convinced, it made him convinced that God will reject him. Even though he was there in church and we were trying to teach him being saved by grace, he just could not accept it. His own religious beliefs were tormenting him. So compare that with the lesson of the near-death experience. It says we only judge ourselves and only for growth purposes. How much freer he would be if he could just accept something like that. Now, when my uncle was murdered many years ago, it was a wake-up call for me. My uncle was gay, and no one in my family would talk about it. He wasn't a church member because the church we were part of wouldn't accept a homosexual as a member of the church. And I remember talking with my brother one night after my uncle's murder, and my brother said something that like it was too bad that my uncle was in hell. Now, I know some people can casually say someone's in hell, but for me, it's never been a casual thing. Hell is described as a place of unending, unimaginable torment for eternity. What God would send a good man there for being the way he was made to be, in the case of my uncle for being gay? This kind of thinking tormented me for over 30 years of my life. This is my personal experience. It put me in my own kind of hell. And I could not love a God who would torment my loved ones and billions of others. That comment was one of the things that triggered me to do my research about my faith and beyond, because that kind of thinking just wasn't acceptable to me. I just couldn't live with it. Now, we can believe someone else's interpretation of an ancient book, or we can believe our common sense, our sense of justice, and the evidence. No one deserves eternal torment, even if we were punished for our quote-unquote sins. No reasonable judge would sentence everyone who comes before him to the death penalty for infractions ranging from jaywalking to murder. And that's what some people believe. Before I came to the understanding that I have now, I want to talk about another stop along the way, and that's in terms of how people read their holy scriptures. I learned a different way of reading the scriptures before I ended up leaving Christianity, and that was something called Christian universalism. And I learned how much the church had changed over the course of the 1500 years since the first 500 years of the church, when they believed that Jesus' sacrifice was universal for everyone. That was a common belief. It was commonly believed in reincarnation for an early part of the church. And those things went away, and we were told that those are not Christian things. So do your research on that. It's a lot more than I can say in this program. But all the testimony we have from near-death experiences to after-death communications to mediumship consistently speak of a life review instead of being judged by someone else. It speaks rather that we're helped to make sense of the life that we just lived, to understand ourselves, to understand what was good and what was less good. We have no evidence supporting things like hell or eternal damnation. Even in hellish NDEs, the people who return from them almost always report a decreased fear of death. They escape their hell the moment they ask for help. One NDE I recently heard, there was a woman describing falling and feeling incredible pain. In her experience, she quote unquote knew that she would fall quote unquote forever, and she knew that there was no escape. Yet she did not fall forever, and she did escape. In the life review, we learn sometimes painfully, and then we progress. Doesn't this make a lot more sense than punishment that leads to more punishment endlessly? And really, this is what the evidence shows. And I think this is good news. So I ask you, trust your understanding, trust your learning, trust the evidence. Then, if it's important to you, reconcile this with your religion, tradition, and belief. I'm not asking anybody to walk away from anything. There can be some reconciliation made. As I said earlier, I discovered something called Christian universalism that made a lot more sense to me than when I was taught before. And I've been taught before that was the only way to read the Bible. When I rejected the idea of hell and I trusted my heart, I dug deep into the Bible and I discovered this other way of reading it that didn't teach the eternal torment of anyone. I read several books by Bible-believing men who think teaching eternal torment is insanity. One of the books is by a gentleman named Boyd Purcell, and I'll link to that book, Christianity Without Insanity. There are people who are Bible believers who don't believe some of the things that other people have told you you might have to believe. So let's move on to philosophical blocks. Let's look on to people that say, where's the evidence? So if your religion isn't preventing you from believing the evidence, it could be your worldview. It could be your particular brand of metaphysics, how you think things work. You may be asking yourself, if this is the truth, why don't I see it here and now? If humans survive the physical death of their bodies, why aren't my loved ones communicating with me? Why can't we find evidence of the other reality? Well, these are all valid questions, and there are a couple of ways to answer them. One is, you just haven't experienced this for yourself yet. I would have reported 0 afterlife communications before my daughter passed away, and I was in my mid-50s at the time she passed. But just because I hadn't experienced afterlife communications didn't mean they didn't exist. It didn't mean that no one had. Other people were having them. Some form of contact between the living and the dead, it's not an exception. It's the norm. Nearly half of American adults believe they've been in contact with someone who has died. And this blew me away. 30% of Americans who say they don't believe in the afterlife still claim to have personal contact with someone who has died. So this isn't a matter of expectation. These are people who say they don't believe in the afterlife, but still think they've had contact with someone who's died. Now, I recently heard of an NDE where a woman who said she was a devout atheist. She was a devout atheist. That was her term. And she said she saw Jesus in her NDE. She still says she can't understand why she saw Jesus because she doesn't believe in Jesus. A 3-year-old Jewish boy had a near-death experience. Kid raised Jewish, 3 years old, said he felt the presence of Jesus when he had his near-death experience. His name is Jacob Cooper. I interviewed him for my podcast. When people who say they don't believe in the afterlife say they had contact, or a self-proclaimed atheist says she saw Jesus, maybe we should pay attention. Over 80% of elderly patients report contact with their departed spouse. Now, again, some people might want to write that off as dementia or wishful thinking, but it's a very well reported communication or contact, and it brings people comfort. Now, some of these experiences can be explained as hallucinations, of course, wishful thinking or the like. But don't we have to wonder why they're so common? And really, more importantly, many of these people end up with reduced grief and improved psychological help. We talked about the psychomantium, or we talked about people that have had EMDR type therapy. Some people experience miraculous healing. They come back cancer-free, cancer completely disappearing. Since Shayna passed and I started experiencing signs and communications, I've noticed something. Suddenly, it went from like no one I ever knew had any kind of afterlife communication to almost everyone I know has experienced something. In my worldview before this, but the people that I knew never talked about their afterlife communications. But after Shayna passed, and I started speaking about mine, people I've known for literally decades started sharing stories I've never heard from them. One buddy, we were in a bar together, shared a story of a visit from his father after his father passed, and I'd known this guy for decades. The neighbor who drove me to the airport to pick up my daughter the night that Shayna passed away, she shared experiences with me that night in the car, which she had never shared with me before. Another neighbor told me about the night her grandmother passed, and her grandmother visited multiple people at the moment of her death in multiple cities. Later, that same woman's husband would tell me about prophetic dreams he and his mother had had. So you might think that no one around you has had these experiences. Maybe they just haven't shared them with you yet. That was my experience. And maybe you haven't seen or heard yet because it's just not your time yet. Once people feel safe opening up with you, you will hear their stories. Possibly after the passing of a child or a spouse, maybe then you'll have your own experience. I would just say to you, until then, don't dismiss the experiences of millions of others. So while after-death communications are natural and really not all that rare, they still aren't our ordinary everyday experience. So why not? Well, as we go through the course, you'll understand what we call our five senses, and we really have many more than five senses, but we call our five senses that we tie to our brains. They're very filtered, very narrow perceptions of the world around us. We can only see a tiny sliver of the light that surrounds us. We can only hear a small band of sounds that vibrate through the air around us. Our dogs can hear and see and smell things that we can only imagine. We are actually blind to most of what's happening around us. Our senses are evolved to keep us alive. They filter out what is perceived as unimportant to that mission. So anything that's not perceived as important to our survival is filtered out by our senses. Billions of years of evolution have honed our senses to perceive a very limited set of what is happening around us. If it wasn't crucial to our survival, our senses didn't evolve to detect it. So it's really reasonable to assume that there are things that we can't detect. And even the instruments that we build to help us detect things our eyes or ears can't detect only detect a different spectrum of the same thing we detect with our senses. We only build instruments to detect, like, for example, light that we can't see because we know that it's there. The spiritual world isn't some far off place. A medium friend of mine says heaven is just 3 feet off the ground. Heaven isn't in some other geographical area. You can't jump on a rocket and fly there. What we call the spirit world is all around us, but it's outside of our normal perception. As I mentioned earlier, our brain evolved to keep our bodies alive, and it filters out what it considers unnecessary for our survival. It's focused in on a certain bandwidth. I use an analogy about tuning in FM radio. We are tuned in to a certain frequency or vibrational frequency around us in this physical body that we're in. As it is, our brain consumes about 20% of our caloric needs. That's pretty high when it comes to evolution. If our brain had to process everything around us, if it was processing all the data that it's taking in or could take in, we wouldn't have survived as a species. It would take up everything we have just to process all the data. But there are some of us that can see into the spirit world regularly. Psychic mediums, whether it's by birth, by training, or both, can communicate with the spirit world, some seeing into it and hearing it. Under extraordinary circumstances, we ordinary people can too. So again, back to the radio analogy, we can only pick up one station at a time on a radio. And it doesn't mean the other stations aren't broadcasting. The tuner just isn't tuned into them. I think our brains in many ways like radio receivers. They're finely tuned to what we need to know to stay alive. But the spirit world is still there, still broadcasting. We're just not picking up on it. Lastly, like my skeptical friend that I mentioned in the course who asked me to connect her with the medium, You might wonder, why doesn't everybody know about this? Well, for thousands of years, humans had a sincere belief in the afterlife. This really informed our understanding of the universe. For most of humankind, we believed in an afterlife. We believed that we've been spirit creatures. Scientists weren't materialistic in those days. They believed that an orderly creator would only create an orderly universe. They studied the creation to understand the creator. Up until around 200 years ago, not many seriously questioned this. That's when science and religion had their split. Science got so good at discovering things about the universe that their hubris set in, and they believed that they could explain natural phenomenon without invoking a creator, without a creative force, intelligence, or God behind it. They were also in competition with the church to influence the worldview. So they kind of had an agreement at first that they kind of split. That science says, we'll handle the world stuff and you handle the spiritual stuff. Materialism, as flawed as it is, was put forward as a plausible explanation in an effort to thwart religion's influence. This came about after the friendly split, when things started getting a little bit more of a rivalry. And eventually a detente was formed where science was to stay in its lane and study the natural world, and religion would stay in its lane and inform us of the spiritual world. But science didn't really stay in its lane. Eventually, they went beyond saying it wasn't their job to study the world of religion or spirit. It said that religion, or the belief in anything, quote, supernatural, or unable to be measured by instruments, didn't exist. Astoundingly to me, this went so far as to deny the existence of the only thing that we can genuinely know exists, and that's consciousness. If you think about it, there's only thing you can say you truly know, that you are, and that is that you are a conscious being. Everything else we can infer with great confidence, but we can never honestly really know it. All we really know is our consciousness. Now, as I wrote this, I was sitting in my family room wearing a green shirt and typing on my laptop. But last night, in a dream state, I was just as sure I was in a classroom that I'd never been in before to take a test. Now, when I was in that classroom in my dream, I knew that it was real. Now, as in my waking state, I assumed this is the real world and that was the dream world. But in my consciousness, they both felt the same. As I mentioned earlier, if someone could find a way to stimulate the inputs to my brain, the neurons that my eyes use to tell my brain what I see, or the neurons that tell my position of my body, if you could stimulate those neurons between my eyes and my brain, you could convince me that I'm seeing something that's not really there. As an example, if you've ever been in a virtual reality simulator, you know that with just some imagery put in front of your eyes, your brain starts to believe you're in a completely different environment and can even be tricked into think that you're falling when you're standing still. That's how vulnerable our perceptions are to not really knowing what's going on around us. So the only thing that we can really know is our experience, and we trust that it's a valid representation of what's really happening around us. Now, what happened is science eventually gave up on studying consciousness, which is really the foundation of everything that we know. As I've just made that point, we can only know our consciousness, and science has given up on it. Some materialists became so convinced that the only real thing was things that they could measure, that they denied the existence of consciousness, and they call consciousness an illusion. Daniel Dennett comes to mind when he says it's the brain's user illusion of itself. And in the West today, most scientists are materialists. And even if they're not materialists, they don't admit that they're not materialists. They don't study consciousness, and they certainly aren't going to study the afterlife. Now, there's not much grant money in it, and their peers would laugh at them and ridicule them if they did. Now, some scientists are calling themselves post-materialists now, and they are kind of coming out of the closet, and they're studying things that we call supernatural, the afterlife. Scientists consider their materialistic point of view superior because they think it's based on evidence, not on beliefs. But they ignore the mountains of evidence because of a foregone conclusion that the evidence cannot exist because the afterlife is impossible. Materialistic dogma is just as much dogma as religious dogma. It's not based on evidence. It's a worldview. It's a metaphysics. It's a philosophy. You may know there's a philosophy called idealism that is just as evidence-based and makes more sense than materialism. The idea that the mind is a product of the brain has been accepted by so many scientists, including neuroscientists, That is hardly questioned, that the brain generates the mind. And if the mind is generated by the brain, it's simple logic that when the brain ceases to function, the mind is gone. This view is so dominant in the scientific community that it's nearly impossible to get funding for psi research, to get funding for parapsychological functions of the mind, including ESP, extrasensory perception, precognition, and psychokinesis. But in spite of that, psi has been studied over and over again. Our government understood the importance of psi enough to conduct research into things like mind control through sending thoughts and the remote viewing, which they showed works. People who have never been to a place can accurately describe or even draw a quote target the scene at that location. Look up MK Ultra if you want to know more. Materialists cannot see the evidence because they refuse to look at it. And when confronted with the evidence, the most that you can evoke from them is well, that's interesting. While psi has been demonstrated to be true time and time again, to the point where precognition and remote viewing aren't really worth conducting experiments about anymore, materialists will still deny it. Now, a few researchers that I mentioned are like Julie Beischel, who studied mediumship, Dr. Penny Satori, studied near-death experiences, Dr. Gary Schwartz, who studied mediumship and post-material persons. They do conduct rigorous scientific studies despite the skepticism and the ridicule. Now, despite materialists' best efforts, this evidence has made its way to some of the most respected scientific journals, like Nature and The Lancet. Professional associations of scientists and scholars, such as the Society for Psychical Research in the UK and the Society for Scientific Exploration in the US, are entirely dedicated to studying these phenomena from a skeptical point of view. IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, was founded by astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell to explore the interplay between scientific knowledge and inner knowing, I should say. Dean Radin is a researcher and an author in the field of parapsychology. He's a senior scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences mentioned above. And he gives us this really enlightening example of how materialist bias plays out in science. Jessica Utz and Ray Hyman reviewed data from the CIA concerning their remote viewing experiments. Professor Utz was a professor of statistics at UC Davis. Her conclusion: using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. In addition to being a professor of statistics, she's very well known to be a well-known methodologist. Ray Hyman was a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. He concluded that the results were free of methodological weaknesses, and the effects sizes were too large and consistent with being dismissed as statistical flukes. His conclusion: something interesting is going on. Let me say that again. Ray Hyman, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, concluded that the results were free of methodological weaknesses and the effect sizes were too large and consistent with being dismissed as statistical flukes. So the data was real, the methodology was real, and the effect was statistically conclusive. But his conclusion was something interesting is going on. So we're supposed to believe that scientists are unbiased. They follow the data. But he couldn't admit that this actually concluded, or you should conclude that this research was real, the psychological research, the psi research was real. Now, science really never proves anything conclusively. Logic can, math can, but science really doesn't. It gives us enough evidence to draw a reasonable conclusion, which scientists do all the time based on data and studies. Most of psychic phenomena occur spontaneously outside the laboratory, right? Psychic things typically happen. Signs that we get after death communications happen spontaneously and outside the laboratory. So scientists often dismiss this as anecdotal, therefore not worthy of consideration. But even within well-designed experiments that show that psychic phenomena are real, some supposedly unbiased scientists cannot bring themselves to say what the data show, that psychic functioning has been well established. Perhaps this is why you haven't heard about psychic functioning being, quote, proven by science. I just gave you a really solid example of how scientists will dismiss the data even when it's there and say, well, isn't that interesting? And then you never hear about it. Now, in a tongue-in-cheek study about whether parachute use prevents death when jumping from a plane, researchers decided to do a randomized hypothesis test. They could not find any participants willing to jump from a plane without a parachute while the plane was flying. So they randomized having people jump from a plane on the ground, some with parachutes and some with empty backpacks. Deaths and injuries were zero for both groups. People jumping out of a plane on the ground, wearing a parachute or with an empty backpack, zero deaths, zero injuries for both groups. So the conclusion that they drew is there's only anecdotal evidence that wearing a parachute when jumping from a plane prevents death or injury. Now, that's a scientific method, and that's a tongue-in-cheek, silly example, but I use it to illustrate this. We know that parachutes prevent death and injury when jumping from a plane, but it's really all based on anecdotal evidence. There have been no randomized studies to prove that wearing a parachute when jumping from a plane prevents death and injuries. No one's ever can study in a controlled, randomized, blind study. Similarly, billions of people have had NDEs and afterlife communications. They have reported their experiences. Some are veridical. They have evidence that they perceive things from outside their bodies when they were quote unquote dead. Yet, because the phenomenon has not been able to be replicated under controlled circumstances, many dismiss this as anecdotal. The fact is that we've relied on anecdotal evidence for most things, for most of our existence as human beings. We take other people's word for things. Now, again, I'm not asking you to believe anything based on faith, but don't ignore the mountains of evidence based upon religious traditions, which may be misinterpretations, or on a point of view of materialism that's really also not based on evidence. Talk to a hospice volunteer or an ER nurse who has witnessed incredible things happening with their dying patients. Now, again, usually the nurses or the hospice volunteers, maybe not so much the doctors, even though doctors are even coming around themselves. But people who have been around people that are dead and dying can tell you some amazing stories. Talk to someone who's had after-death communications, verified by the evidence that the deceased gave them. Talk to someone who's had an NDE. Read the books by Bruce Grayson, Kenneth Ring, PMA Chatwater, or one of the hundreds of books written by near-death experiences. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to be skeptical. In fact, it's good to be skeptical. But in the end, like doubting Thomas, examine the evidence and have faith.